History is a guide to navigate in perilous times. The past dictates who we are and why we are the way we are. It is rather reprehensible that when handed history in its accurate, well-researched form, packaged and palatable so that a fifth grader could digest and a 50-year-old could appreciate, the visionaries who fight to go down in history make little, no, let's call it as it is, make no effort to ensure that every school child has a copy of his own local history. After all, how can we know where we are going if we don't know where we came from? Thanks to Robert DeVoe, Guy Ellis and Jolene Hampson, the history of St Lucia comes to life with a comprehensive record of St Lucia's turbulent, colorful and romantic past. Beginning with the formation of this island, subsequent Amerindian occupation, the pages relive colonialization by France and England. It also explains in detail why St Lucia was such a coveted gem. As the pages turn, the chapters elucidate the rise and fall of King Sugar, the afflictions of slavery, the feverish hopes and fears of the brigand wars, and eventual emancipation. After 1838, St Lucia's free blacks were muddled up with indentured laborers from as far as Scotland and India. This vivid recollection also tells the true story of Mother England's contribution to the development of Fair Helen in terms of infrastructure, healthcare, and education. With the blessings of the authors, Untold Stories presents The History of St Lucia, Part 1, from 50 million years ago to the year 1913. St Lucians, we must remember, if the past has been an obstacle and a burden, knowledge of the past is the safest and surest emancipation. Volcanic activity sparked the genesis approximately 50 million years ago, and in a long series of volcanic eruptions, the central, northern, and eastern parts of St Lucia were created. The initial result was high, jagged-edged mountains separated by deep waters. Over millions of years, these tall peaks were blunted by the erosive effects of rain, wind, and gravity. Boulders slid downhill and filled up the deep ravines, creating the expansive fertile alluvial valleys known as Roseau, Cul-de-Sac, Mabria Valley, Fodor, Marquis, and Trumassy. Erosion also wore down the mountain ranges that run along the spine of St Lucia. The Badlil today peaks a tad over 900 feet above sea level. 26 million years ago, while dinosaurs roamed Jurassic Parks in other parts of the world, St Lucia had still not reached the shape it is today. A fresh round of volcanic eruption was jolting the island into life, creating tall mountains in the west and center, including Mount Jimmy, Piton Canawi, Mont Pébouche, Mont Tabac, Mont Parasol, Go, and Petit Piton, near Soufrière. The collapse of a huge crater caused an area of land 6 kilometers in diameter to drop, forming a bow-like depression. On the floor of this crater, a series of very violent volcanic explosions subsequently took place, spewing glowing avalanches of gas and ash and ejecting boulders with such force that some landed as far as 13 kilometers away. Gos and Petit were formed as a result of magma inside the nozzle of two volcanic mountains that cooled slower than the surrounding rock. As erosion wore down the domes and skirts of the mountains, their triangular-shaped cones remained, making them landmarks unique to St. Lucia. Located at 13.85 degrees north, 61 degrees west, Martinique being its closest neighbor north, and St. Vincent being just 40 kilometers away to the south, this 238 square mile rock has an average temperature of 27 degrees Celsius and typical humidity of 75%. A rich fertile ground where flora and fauna abound, hundreds of indigenous plants and a variety of animals made this land their home. They were not alone. Recorded history, artifacts, and science put the early inhabitants of the island here as early as 200 AD. Originally, these Amerindians made the voyage from South America by canoe, most likely landing at the southern end of the island. As they steered their boats through reefs and calmer waters, they would have seen shores heavily covered with mangroves. Behind them, the land was flat, but in the distance, it rose into jagged mountain peaks from which wide, sparkling, clear rivers ran down to the sea. An abundance of fish, crabs, and other shellfish waited impatiently to be caught. Micoud is probably the richest in Amerindian history. Between Micoud and canals, archaeologists have found evidence of nearly 10 settlements. Remains of cooking pits, pots, tools, and ornaments have been discovered in Trumasse and Micoud Bay. For generations, Amerindian people in Ayanola taught their children about the natural resources of the land. They learned how to read the skies and navigate the seas. They also learned tool production, herbal properties of plants, and of course, how to draw. Many of their carvings dot the southern communities even today. Historical records suggest that the Arawaks were constantly traveling up the chain of islands to avoid confrontations with the more aggressive Caribs. So it came as no surprise that recorded history places the Caribs firmly on the island as the stage was set for the greatest transformation in Uranora since the formation of the Pitons. In November 1493, Christopher Columbus completed his second successful crossing of the Atlantic Ocean with a fleet of 17 ships carrying 1,500 men. At the break of dawn, the crew spotted an island. The day was Sunday, and they christened it Dominica. Unable to find a safe harbor, the crew sailed northward. Over the next few days, Columbus saw and named Marigalante, Guadeloupe, Montserrat, Nevis, St. Christopher, St. Eustatius, Saba, St. Croix, and the Virgin Islands. Then he proceeded to the Greater Antilles. Columbus did not notice St. Lucia on his boat ride in 1498 either. In 1499, a private voyage was made by Alonso de Ojeda, accompanied by Americo Vespucci and Juan de la Cosa, Columbus's navigator on his previous voyage. In 1500, de la Cosa drew a map which featured St. Lucia under the name El Falcon. Other historians believe that Columbus spotted St. Lucia on June 15, 1502, during his fourth and final voyage, when his ship made landfall in Martinico, then traveled northward to Hispaniola. An old persistent legend in St. Lucia holds that before the island appeared on any official map, French sailors were shipwrecked on its shores, and it being the 13th of December, named the island in honor of St. Lucie. The 16th century in the New World is known as the Great Dying. In 1512, Spain specially authorized its conquistadors to capture and enslave the Amerindians in the islands of Los Barbados, Dominica, Martinico, Santa Lucia, San Vicente, La Ascension, and Parago. But the Caribs in Dominica and St. Lucia put up spectacular defense of their land, chasing and defeating Goliath with well-arched poison arrows. When European ships subsequently landed on the island later that century, it was to lick their wounds, obtain water, wood, or provisions. Ironically, sometimes the Carib would trade with the greatest diplomacy. Other times, they would attack the white men mercilessly. Occasionally, Spanish vessels loaded with treasure got shipwrecked while navigating the island chain. Legend has it that on the 13th of March 1597, a storm sank the Spanish galleon, the San Fernando, 2 miles northeast of the southernmost tip of St Lucia. By the mid-16th century, the Caribs in St Lucia remained fully in control of their homeland. It was the 12th of April, 1605, when the Olive Blossom sailed from England, loaded with supplies and new settlers, destined for the budding colony of British Guyana. The crew no doubt had dreams of wealth and high adventure in an exotic new land. Instead, what they found was a nightmare tale of friendship, betrayal, and bloodshed. These are the events of the mutiny of the Olive Blossom, as recounted by John Nichol, one of the few survivors.
Shortly after our hopeful departure, the Olive Blossom was blown off course. After 17 miserable weeks at sea, a journey marred by extreme rationing of provisions, hunger, and a series of mutinies, it was St Lucia that offered us refuge, not Guyana. We were immediately made welcome by the island's Carib inhabitants, who met us bearing gifts of food and tobacco. So gracious was their reception that 67 of us chose to remain here. We purchased some Carib fishing huts at the mouth of the Vieux-Fort River, about 2 kilometers from the main village to the north. The village chief named Anthony was once a slave in Margarita. Relations were cordial, but we knew well enough to stay close to our huts, because just as the Caribs knew of the atrocities committed by our fellow Europeans in other islands, so were we well aware of their reputation for ferocity. Antony's men visited us daily to trade food for English hatchets, knives, beads, fish hooks, and thimbles, and other trifles. Things went smoothly for 4 weeks until Antony's brother, a chief named Ogromat, arrived from St. Vincent. Trouble started when Antony claimed that Ogromat planned on bringing 12 canoes loaded with Caribs from St. Vincent to murder us. On the contrary, we found Ogromat to be very kind. He in turn warned that Antony would cut our throats and therefore urge us to kill his brother first. Not knowing who to trust, matters deteriorated further when we offended Antony by confiscating a sword that he had bought from one of us. Then, one day we learned that the Caribs had gold. When asked where they found it, they claimed to have found it on a mountain on the northwest part of St. Lucia, quite possibly Gros Piton. We were very distrustful at first, suspecting an ambush ploy, but for 16 men, the allure of undiscovered riches was too great to pass up. Greed overrode good judgment as they set off on their gold-finding mission in our only boat, no less. That was the last we ever saw of them. Following the disappearances, the once friendly Caribs abruptly stopped visiting our settlement, leaving us hungry and curious and forcing us to visit the Carib village. Upon arrival, the Carib men were nowhere in sight, but the women appeared to be preparing a feast. They refused us food, and so driven by starvation, we helped ourselves to as much as we could carry from their gardens. The next day, Ogramot, his father, and a group of Caribs visited us, bringing us roasted crab. They invited us to the village for more. I was very suspicious, but gave in when Ogramot promised me the hammocks I had been begging for. Carrying our guns, we left without hesitation, since the Caribs appeared unarmed except for one sword. And so began our arduous trek from Mola Sheikh to Anse de Sable. At Anse de Sable, the Caribs struck. Ogramot signaled the attack by embracing my comrade Alexander, while his father struck him down. Then came a volley of arrows out of the wood where the rest of Ogramot's men lay in wait. Too late. We realized that we were trapped. We dropped our guns and pulled out our swords, but this only spurred them on. And so it continued, with Caribs shooting arrow upon arrow at us. Our attack was as futile as our defense. I barely escaped, and by the time the Caribs attacked our camp, my friends and I had the great cannon ready to defend ourselves. They shot burning arrows into the huts and charged under the cover of the thick smoke. They killed 2 of us, but we managed to hide behind the cannon, which we fired into the crowd of Caribs, forcing them to retreat. For the whole week, the attacks continued every day for several hours. With no shelter, no food, and no defense, we finally surrendered and gave up everything we had left in exchange for a canoe and some cloth. Finally, under the cover of darkness on September 26th, we, 19 survivors, fled St Lucia in our Carib canoe, marking the end of the first ever English settlement in the Lesser Antilles.
In 1627, the King of England granted letters of patent to Jacques Earl of Calais, giving him ownership of all the Caribbean islands, including St Lucia, Grenada, Martinique, and Barbados. Colonization was attempted, but not without Amerindian opposition. Constant battles between England, France, and the Caribs were wearing all 3 combatants down. So, in 1660, France and England struck up a temporary alliance to once and for all bring the Caribs of the Lesser Antilles under control. April 6, 1663, 600 Caribs from all over the Lesser Antilles paddled their canoes to Barbados and formally signed over full and absolute title of St Lucia to Lord Willoughby, who was then in charge of all of the Caribbean islands. After the treaty was signed, 1,100 Englishmen in 5 warships, accompanied by 600 Amerindians in 17 pirogues, left Barbados and proceeded to invade St Lucia. The French furiously denounced the sale as a hoax, but citing the overwhelming show of force and documents this time around, they quickly surrendered. Nearing the end of the 16th century, this three-way fight for Ayanola was taking its toll on the native population. A census conducted in the early 1700s recorded only 37 Caribs remaining as a society. By 1730, the Caribs were dead. The last mention of them as the rightful owners of the island was December 1719. Angola, the Cape Verdes, the coast of Guinea and Senegal all supplied slaves to the French and British traders who traced the coordinates of John Hawkins, the first Brit who carried Africans from Sierra Leone across the Atlantic in 1562 in what became known as the Middle Passage. It is estimated that between the years 1451 and 1879, a total of 9,566,100 enslaved Africans reached the Caribbean and the Americas alive. Needless to say, countless perished. However, slavery did not take real hold in St. Lucia until the late 1720s. By 1730, there were 463 people living in St. Lucia, including 175 slaves. Between 1799 and 1801, 238 slaves were imported into St. Lucia from Grenada, Martinique, and St. Vincent. St. Lucian planters were also being supplied by Bajan slave wholesalers. Slaves brought in fresh from Africa were referred to as saltwater slaves, whereas those born in the Caribbean were called Creoles. 1/3 of all new slaves died within the first year. New arrivals were put to work in the fields and in the sugar factories. Creoles were usually imported from islands with a longer tradition of sugar production. Slaves were considered movable objects, and as such, they could be mortgaged, pawned, or sold. They themselves could not own property. Those from different plantations could not congregate without prior authorization. They could not treat disease, with the exception of snake bites. They were strictly forbidden to buy or sell anything and could not carry weapons, nor could they act as witnesses in any legal proceedings. From the 1770s onward, not even human suffering was allowed to stand in the way of King Sugar. The sweetness of the crop could not disguise the bitterness of the human casualties it dragged in its wake. As the amount of land on the sugar expanded, so did the slave population. Between 1772 and 1789, more than 5,000 new slaves were imported. By that time, the island's population stood at 19,230. Of these, 16,003 were slaves, and there were 44 sugar plantations, indicated by the red dots on this map. During this period of economic development, Mother Nature would throw 2 curveballs at Helen, which threatened to knock her lights out. In 1776, the Soufrière volcano erupts with cataclysmic fury. 1780, tectonic plates collide, causing a massive earthquake on the island. But the worst was yet to come. On the evening of October 10th, 1780, the slaves and their masters stood helpless as the island took a pounding for 36 hours straight from the most powerful hurricane in St Lucia's recorded history. Approximately 800 lives were lost, and only 2 houses remained standing in Castries. While slaves and their masters tried to make sense of the melee, hundreds of captive Africans made a dash for freedom. This, in addition to the unrest that had resulted from the British takeover 2 years earlier, left the mostly French planters at their wits' end. The wind of change ruffled the earth and sparked life into an ember of hope that was so strong, the heady scent galvanized irreversible insurgents. The revolt of 1790 in Martinique was the precursor of the actions which followed in St Lucia. For whatever reason, slaves in Soufrière belonging to Monsieur Vert convinced themselves that their counterparts in Martinique had been set free. They revolted and demanded their own freedom. This rebellion was short-lived as a number of the ringleaders were seized and executed. They were beheaded and their heads were strung up at prominent locations in the area. In St Lucia, law and order was deteriorating rapidly. August 23, 1792 saw another violent uprising among the slaves in Soufrière. This too was short-lived, but it was the catalyst for the subsequent actions taken by the slaves island-wide. They began abandoning the estates and leaving the crops to wither. Governor de Guimard, realizing that his authority and power had eroded, left the island and fled to Martinique. Brimstone, thunder, hurricane, earthquake. Nothing deterred the conquest for sweet St Lucia. In 1781, France tried to reconquer St Lucia, but their invasion of Groseillers was ill-advised. The British opened fire from here at Pigeon Island before the French could even disembark. Pigeon Island proved to be a strategic gold mine, and it was from here in March 1782 that Admiral Rodney spotted the French fleet floating from Fort Royal in Martinique. Rodney gave chase with his British squadrons, and on the 12th of April, he intercepted the fleet. Admiral Rodney's army defeated the French Navy, including his flagship, the Ville de Paris, the largest warship in the world at the time. But his victory celebration was short-lived. By September 1783, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and once again, the island became the property of France. In 1785, the city once known as Carénage was renamed Castries in honor of Charles Eugène Gabriel de la Croix, Marquis de Castries. The European colonial powers sought to gain a foothold in the Caribbean and to establish settlements in the islands of the archipelago. The British led the pack by settling in St. Kitts in 1623, Barbados 1627, Antigua, Nevis, and Montserrat in 1636. The French, not to be outdone, nipped at the heels of the English and colonized part of St. Kitts in 1627, Dominica in 1632, and Martinique and Guadeloupe in 1635. The island of St. Lucia was a coveted gem which was sought after by the British and the French colonial powers. While the majority of the other islands were seized to be developed for their agricultural output, St. Lucia was desired for its strategic location. For the English, it would act as a military buffer to protect Barbados, and for the French, it would offer the same kind of protection for Martinique against the English. Conflict in and around the island was exacerbated by the wars which were fought by the English and French that began in Europe and spilled over in the Caribbean. A watershed event in modern European history, the French Revolution, began in 1789 and ended in the late 1790s with the ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte. During this period, French citizens raised and redesigned their country's political landscape, uprooting century-old institutions as absolute monarchy and the feudal system. Although it failed to achieve all its goals and at times degenerated into a chaotic bloodbath, the movement played a critical role in shaping modern nations by showing the world the power inherent in the will of the people. As in France, in Haiti, there were many different groups of people, all with conflicting interests. Also, as in France, in Haiti, the oppressed groups, notably the free-colored people and the slaves, fought both peacefully and violently against the tyranny of their government of the laws restricting fundamental human rights and liberties. Beginning a little earlier than the Haitian Revolution, the revolution in France profoundly affected the political and social atmosphere in France's colonies in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution benefited greatly from the Enlightenment ideas of progress and freedom, the latter of which was consummated by the National Assembly in the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen. The revolutionary government in France abolished slavery in all French colonies in 1794.
These events scared Mother England, and certainly she was not about to allow her colonies to be infected by this revolutionary virus. Therefore, the stakes could not be higher, and victory had to be hers at any cost.
The romance of the French was no match for the rivalry and sheer determination of the British in their unrelenting conquest for sweet Eleonora. By January 1794, they were at it again in what was dubbed the War of the Brigands. Governor de Richard of France wanted to arm St Lucia's blacks so they could help defend the island, but the remaining white planters would have none of it. Aware of an imminent English invasion, the National Convention in Paris finally bit the bullet and abolished the enslavement of all Negro people in its colonies. It had taken years, but finally, France was making liberté, égalité, fraternité count for its slaves as well. In a cruel stroke of irony, by the time the decree reached St. Lucia, the island had already been recaptured by the British. Several other battles ensued, with England putting up formidable defense in some battles and conceding defeat in others. It is said that at one point, St. Lucia was considered so valuable that the British were willing to trade all of Canada for St. Lucia.
May 1814, the Peace of Paris Treaty is signed and the island officially, and for the final time, becomes British. The battle for Helen lasted well over 120 years. This constant tug of war gave rise to a special blend of French words and the seasoning of English pronunciations. The result? The birth of the Creole language. June 1803, the General Post Office opened up. Amidst this good tide, a spell of bad luck was about to hit the land of the iguana. On the 15th of October, 1805, a fire raged through Castries, leaving 200 houses in ashes. It was further compounded by the fact that all the structures were wooden and there was no fire brigade. April 6, 1813, fire tore through the town once again. In May 1813, the Peace of Paris Treaty was signed and the island officially becomes British. But this could not deter the string of misfortunes ahead. December 1816, an earthquake rattled and rolled St Lucia's foundation. Then, less than a year later, disaster came in the form of wind and rain, which completely destroyed Government House, then located on Brazil Street. 46 people perished, including the governor. A year later, Government House at Montfortune was constructed. At the time, the island's population stood at 18,595. Overall, the first few decades of the 19th century can best be described as a period of uneasy apprehension. The smell of freedom was so close it was intoxicating. The fear that a captive supply of labor would soon be set free spurred the slave drivers to squeeze every ounce of forced labor from black brows. This only fueled more uprisings and brazen marriage attempts. In June 1829, planters reported that in various parts of the island, gangs of runaway slaves were preparing to attack the estates. While fear gripped the whites, the period saw a steady flow of runaway slaves from Martinique, lured by the promise of freedom in St Lucia. They risked it all and paddled to St Lucia by the hundreds. But alas, freedom. When the sun set on the evening of July 31st, 1834, anxiety was thick in the air. The word on every Negro's lips was freedom. A special midnight mass was held. 13,285 men, women, and children thanked the Lord for setting them free from slavery at long last. In an all too familiar paradoxical twist, the newly liberated blacks were forced to work 40 hours per week of unpaid labor to their former masters. It was called the apprenticeship period. Apprenticeship gave planters a first-hand taste of what full emancipation would bring. Citing a gloomy financial forecast, many planters packed up. To appease the slave owners and to quell opposition to emancipation, Britain provided £20 million as compensation, not to the blacks, but rather to their enslavers. In St Lucia, planters received a total of £342,155 for their slaves. The rationale behind this reparation was that Britain had originally allowed the system of slavery to exist, thereby encouraging planters to invest their monies to buy and maintain slaves. Now that the British government had changed its mind and laws on the issue, it was effectively confiscating capital investment. Therefore, the planters had to be repaid. With the full abolition of slavery in 1838 inevitably ahead of them, planters everywhere in the West Indies began to look for another source of cheap, reliable labor to work their estates. They found this in Southeast Asia. Between 1845 and 1917, hundreds of thousands of indentured workers sailed from India to the Caribbean. Most went to Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, but some 6,000 set foot on shore in St Lucia. Just over 1,600 people arrived here between 1856 and 1865, and another 4,427 Indians sailed to St Lucia between 1878 and 1893. The labor contracts under which East Indians worked varied.
But as a rule, they were bound to work on a designated estate for 5 years in return for a wage, housing, clothing, food, and medical care. After 5 years, they could choose between owning 10 acres of land or £10 sterling, or they could, after a further 5 or 10 years of industrial residence, get free passage back to India. When the sun rose on August 1st, 1838, the atmosphere seemed surreal. Finally, the much anticipated day had arrived. No more slavery, no more apprenticeship, just freedom. Full emancipation came on August 1st, 1838. This memorable day passed without upheaval and disruptions feared by the authorities. 1838 was also the year the Palladium and the St Lucia Free Press rolled out. In 1827, in anticipation of post-emancipation lawlessness, Mother England financed the construction of Her Majesty's prisons in St Lucia. It was built to accommodate 60 prisoners and was located on Bridge Street in Castries. This photograph from the year 1900 shows a police officer in colonial uniform guarding the bridge, with police headquarters and the Royal Jail in the background. The Royal St Lucia Police Force was established in 1843, only 5 years after the formation of the very first law enforcement department as we know them in London. Initially, the force was headed by an inspector who was assisted by 3 sergeants and 24 corporals and constables. The inspector had to perform the confusing duty of magistrate by taking depositions in criminal cases and acting as a prosecutor in court. Confusing, funny, but true. 1839 again, the island was rocked by 2 powerful earthquakes in January and September respectively. There was 1 confirmed death, but it would be yellow fever that would kill 13 people that year. As free men of African origin began influencing the very fabric of social structure in St. Lucia, the landscape of the town began to evolve. By 1844, Castries was bound on the north by a bay and Sans Souci, on the east by Chaussee Road, and on the west by the harbour. There were 400 houses and 4,000 residents. Remember, the Castries harbour was originally a volcanic crater which flooded when its western walls collapsed. The Castries Wharf was built to capitalize on the emerging coal industry. Ships needed bituminous coal to fuel their engines. With this new facility, Castries became one of the few ports in the region with deep water landing facilities. The town's ambitions was reflected in St. Lucia's new crest, which used the motto, "A safe harbour for ships." Construction of the minor basilica commenced in 1827, but petered out because of lack of funds. In January 1834, the cornerstone was laid after numerous delays. The walls were completed a year later, and after a problem with the roof was resolved, the church was blessed and dedicated to St. Flora on May 12, 1836. Another new addition was the Anglican Church. The first stone was laid in 1830 and construction was completed 2 years later. It could accommodate 200 worshippers comfortably. In 1843, the Bishop of Barbados christened the building in the name of the Holy Trinity. In 1844, St. Lucia had 4 main roads. The first extended from Castries to Soufrière along the west coast and from there on to Vieux-Fort, covering a distance of 60 miles. The second road ran 45 miles from Castries across what was then the Trace, Barra Barra and the Bamboo to Dennery on the east coast. This round-the-island road was known as the Chemin Royal. The third road was 9 miles, running from Castries to the village of Grosley. A fourth road diverged from the Castries-Grosley Road at Choc, turning east across the northern tip of the island, all the way to Grand Dance. While new infrastructural changes were occurring with a trickle of British pounds, the healthcare department was hemorrhaging.
But the cholera epidemic in 1854 would highlight the degree to which Queen Victoria was neglecting her faithful subjects. When cholera visited in the mid-19th century, it killed 150,000 people in the Caribbean. From July to November 1854, cholera swept through St Lucia, killing an estimated 1,400 people, the majority of them from Soufriere. At the time, the Colonial Hospital was perched here at Fiji. In 1884, it was burned to the ground, and the new hospital was built at a whopping cost of £8,686. On June 21st, 1887, it was christened Victoria Hospital in commemoration of the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. The precise origin of the La Rose and La Marguerite flower festivals is unknown. They were conceived during the period of slavery and are floral societies in which some members of St Lucian community divided themselves. Both groups have a king and queen as a head and other dignitaries patterned upon the socio-economic structure of colonial society, such as judges, policemen, soldiers, and nurses, roles which were far beyond the real aspiration of the folk population in ordinary life. August 30th was designated as La Rose and October 17th as La Marguerite. On that day, all members dressed up in the fineries of their respective roles marched to the church for service, preceded by their parade through the streets. The Catholic Church, in spite of the occasional good relation, at various times opposed the societies because of extravagance, quarreling between the two groups, and the rioting that engendered them. In 1860, both flower festivals were excommunicated from the Catholic Church. While they struggled to maintain their standards, folk dancers in St. Lucia always remained 2 steps ahead. Between 1845 and 1850, 4% of all children were enrolled in schools. By 1896, nearly half a century after emancipation, Helen had 46,671 children and an estimated 10,000 of school age. There were 36 schools, but only 2,256 pupils attended school regularly. To make matters worse, few children understood English before reaching Standard 4, despite the fact that they were being taught in English. Knowledge of the language was confined to a few simple words of command. Out of school, children heard and spoke nothing but Creole. It is noteworthy that the French language was only officially abolished in 1838. A population census in 1881 recorded 38,551 inhabitants of St. Lucia. Unemployment was at an all-time high, but With commencement of earthworks on the Panama Canal in 1882, the unemployment tide was about to subside. Between 1882 and 1886, 30 to 40% of all St. Lucian adult men moved to Panama. Financially, the mass emigration clearly benefited the island. However, 6 years after the boom, the demise came with the collapse of the French company who were undertaking the project, and 20,000 West Indians became stranded in Panama. About 1/3 of all St. Lucian migrants never saw sweet St. Lucia again. With an ever-increasing number of seagoing vessels, St. Lucia's prime location and sheltered bay seemed ideal for storing and selling coal to passing steamships as fuel. Soon, huge piles of coal brought in from Britain and the United States dominated the skyline. The transfer to and from ships was done by women porters who acrobatically balanced 100-pound buckets on their head. For each load, they earned half a penny during the day and a whole penny on the night shift. Nearing the end of the 1800s, unemployment was further reduced with the building of extra military barracks on the Mon. And here at VG in 1896, doubling the capacity of the garrisons to 700 men. But by the middle of 1899, building works drew to a close, unskilled laborers were laid off, and misery seemed set to return. To everyone's relief, in August 1900, new military works were announced, the biggest of them being the construction of military tramways from Castries to Mont Fortune. The end of the 19th century was pregnant with developmental changes in all facets. 1879 saw the establishment of the Castries Fire Brigade. The Voice newspaper was launched on January 24, 1885, but the headlines and stories which ran in this periodical did not reflect the everyday stories of St. Lucian society. Instead, it was merely related information passed on by our colonial masters. There was no news from Castries, Monrepo, or even Choiseul. On March 17, 1885, a new Windward Island government was established, which comprised St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago. On the 1st of January, 1893, the Place des Armes was formally renamed Columbus Square. The 6th of August, 1894, the Castries Market is officially opened. A severe cyclone swept through St. Lucia on the 10th to the 11th of September, 1898. The island took a beating. The last year in the century was spent nursing Helen's economy and infrastructure. 1901 was an unusually quiet year. The 4 Marshall lands were purchased to create recreational grounds. In 1902, St. Lucia's 49,883 residents were spared as the volcanoes in St. Vincent and Martinique erupted with terrifying violence. The Mount Pelee eruption was dubbed the worst volcanic disaster of the 20th century. 30,000 persons perished. Louis-Auguste Sipari was one of the 3 survivors. Although St. Lucia was between 2 fires, its solfatara did not come to life. October 1903, a new system of lighting was inaugurated. The first Kitson light was installed and lit on Brazil Street. Strikes, riots, looting and shooting characterized the second quarter of 1907. Coal carriers laid down their baskets. Violence escalated in Castries, Roseau, and Dennery. Police killed 7 persons, while 37 others were left nursing wounds. This was the same year that income tax was introduced and 3 powerful earthquakes shook for Helen. Mother Earth would not let up, as Helen was jolted once again in May and June of 1908. A census taken in 1911 recorded the population at 48,637. On the 22nd of June that year, the coronation of King George V was celebrated. By 1913, Castries had pipe-borne water, and it was the year that the very first car was imported into St. Lucia by George Barnard. Join us in part 2 of Untold Stories, the history of St. Lucia, as we review the past 100 years from 1913 to 2013. World War I, 26 St. Lucians perished as the HMS Good Hope is sunk.
the Ravin Poisson disaster, the Great Depression, spectacular strikes orchestrated by political wannabes, adult suffrage, the formation of the St Lucia Labour Party, and the father of the nation's rise to power. St Lucia mourns the death of King Sugar. No trip down memory lane would be complete if we did not explain the tumultuous late 70s and early 80s. Prisoners escaped from jail with little effort. Hurricane Allen, Tropical Storm Debbie, and Hurricane Thomas decimate St. Lucia. The banana industry goes from riches to rags. Our Nobel Prize winners place us on the map of intellectual history. A new SLP savior brings a landslide victory. Helen rekindles her love for an 80-year-old politician. A visa gets revoked. 17 people die in a horrific vehicular crash. And the dreaded three-letter word makes history.